know it's great to visit with all our colleagues, and so you're welcome to bring your glass of wine right on up front here, and we'll start our presentation. And please feel free to continue to come on in and join us. So over the past 8 years, Portland CSI has been building the Industry Forum into the great event you're part of today. This is the first time that we've ever co-located the event with the Building Envelope Council. And were some of you here for most of the day? It was a long day, I bet, but a full day, right? Lots of great information, and wonderful to get together with all your colleagues. It's been made possible by the vision and work of many very talented professionals, so please hold your applause. I'm just going to take a moment to introduce the Industry Forum team, and if you're up here, please stand. Tony DiVincenzo from Ideate, Alexander Lungershausen from Henneberry Eddy, he did our work earlier on the 6x10s. Bud Henson from WindowTech, Corey Morris with Carlton Hart Architects, Randy Page, architect, and special thanks to Ash Urban and Katana Palioka from Ideate, and Ken Rocco with the Facade Group who coordinated our event with BEC, and I'm Jody Moore. And please join me in showing our appreciation for the builders of the Industry Forum. Thanks. I want to shout out to all the great sponsors who made it happen and bring it all together here today. And Elephant's Delicatessen for providing the delicious repast, and to the greatest venue in Portland, of course, the Portland Art Museum. And we're happy to be here. Thank you all for being here and participating, adding your good energy to raising the bar for collaboration and for design excellence. And it's now my pleasure to introduce the individual who inspired a vision that's brought this event to life. This gentleman who invited our keynote speaker and has every year for the Industry Forum, and presenter this evening, a wonderful collaborator and a keeper of cultural tradition, Don Stastny. Donald J. Stastny, FAIA, has been practicing architect and urban designer and process facilitator for over 40 years, rebuilding communities physically and culturally throughout the country and the world. Recognized as one of the preeminent competition advisors and managers in North America, Don designs competitions, opportunities for design professionals to create outstanding architecture in places. And I asked him what he's been up to lately. Well, since I asked, he's been working on defining the public realm as the fundamental building block of the city. He's been conducting design competitions for the National World War I Memorial in Washington, D.C., 3 facilities on the National Mall, the framework open space plan for Cambridge, Massachusetts, Waller Creek in Austin, Texas, St. Louis, Missouri grounds at their signature arch, all of which are very exciting, wonderful urban projects. Don's continuing to develop the Design Excellence Program with the Oregon Military Department, and we're seeing results of that program with the OMD's newest generation of facilities. He's also teaching, creating a civic design academy at Portland State University, and actively designing as well 2 new museums, the Oregon Military Museum and the Siletz Tribal Cultural Center. He led the design team for the Kalapapa Memorial in Molokai, Hawaii, a memorial for the 8,000 souls that were sent to Molokai when they were diagnosed with leprosy. And he understands much about the cultures of various places and really dives into understanding what happened with those people, and is doing a beautiful job with that. And what you may not know about Don, in addition to his many professional ventures, he's also active as a fine artist, creating beautiful and intriguing bronze sculptures, explorations in form derived from natural erosion processes and cultural storytelling, and as only Don can tell it. And he's had various openings in our town and in Bend lately with his work, and very exciting, beautiful work. A fellow in AIA, American Institute of Certified Planners and Institute of Urban Design, a master of both theory and practice. Don is a driving force for collaboration and a fierce advocate for design excellence. And he's a lot of fun. So please help me welcome our own Northwest treasure, and my friend, Don Stassman.
Thank you all. Good evening. A little better. Come on. Good evening. That's better. Okay. First of all, I want to, if I may, recognize Jennifer Manhard down here. Jen, would you stand? Of the many design competitions that I've run over the last 12 to 15 years, Jennifer's been my associate and has made a lot of these things happen. So I can go around and wave my arms and everything else, and Jen makes sure that she's there and that we keep on schedule and do the other things that are part of it. I think the May Industry Forum, as I said last year, is a kind of a wonderful, May is kind of a wonderful year. I mean, or wonderful month in the year, in that it is the date of the Industry Forum, which has become an event here in Portland. It is also Patty Tillett's and my birthday month, and both of us are 10.5 in dog years this year, if you can do the math on that. And it is also, for many of us, a high point, and it is a finalist of Dancing of the Stars for my wife, and for The Voice for me. So it's important that we understand what May does for us, and personally and within Portland. The speaker that we have tonight is someone that I've known for a number of years. And one of the things that Jen and I experience as we handle these design competitions is really beginning to have the opportunity to meet and work with pretty fantastic people around the nation and around the world that bring certain aspects to the fore. And my first rub with Rob Rogers was a design competition that Jen and I put on in Chicago for the Kroc family for a YMCA community center in South Chicago. And we had an entry at that point from a really unknown firm called Rogers Marvel out of New York City. And it was a striking but not complete kind of idea of what could be. After that competition, I called Rob and Rob Rogers and Jonathan Marvel, and I said, you know, you guys are going to be there someday. And I want you to, as kind of the grandfather, I want you to keep coming to these competitions, keep coming to the party. Well, that has come to the fore. And tonight I'm kind of a proud papa in a lot of ways of having Rob come to here to speak. Rob himself, he was born in Denver, went to Rice University and to the Harvard GSD, Graduate School of Design, and after that taught for a while and started his own practice. And at some point he developed a partnership with Jonathan Marvel, and with Rogers Marvel they spent almost 20 years together doing pretty fantastic work in all phases of design, from furniture to streetscapes to buildings, without kind of limitation of thinking what they could or could not do. I think the message I have as the father, grandfather to Rob tonight is that Rob will never be a starchitect. And I'm saying that out of deep respect because of the way that he attacks the discipline of design, the analysis that he does, and the resultant collaboration that he works with his various people. So, unfortunately, you will not be the next Frank Gehry, I predict, but you will be greater than that. You might be Vitruvius. One of the things that Rob said in his recent book, which I think is really telling, it's not about doing things over and over. It's about doing things for the first time really well. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest and friend, Rob Rogers.
Well, I can tell you that my high school Latin teacher would never have made the comparison to Vitruvius. It's really a pleasure to be with you tonight. Thank you, Dawn, very much, and thank you, Portland, for inviting me this evening. Dawn mentioned a book which was published a little over a year ago, and I finally decided after 20-plus years of practice that one of the perpetual challenges I faced was talking to potential clients and to peers and colleagues about what we do, because it's not a completely form-driven kind of practice. We're for sure not typologically driven. You know, when I'm on a short list and anybody asks for 12 examples of the project that we're submitting for, I already withdraw because I'm not going to compete in that realm. So when I put the book together, I decided the really critical thing to do is to actually try and put down your principles that guide you regardless of a project's size, scale, location, or cost. And so I ended up outlining a series of those, and I'm going to open the talk this evening with just 3 of those, but try and describe a little bit about what is it that is behind our thinking and behind our work. And the first one of those is what I call the impact of small things. And we all know in practice that there's a whole range of issues and criteria that affect decision-making and design thinking. And a lot of times we found that it's actually relatively small pieces that create big things or big changes. And so when we try to put together, and I wrote this book with my 4 current associate partners participating in different ways in conversations. To try and be clear about it is we seek examples that help us understand and clarify these sort of goals and principles. So when I talk about the impact of small things, I may look at the work of the artist Fred Sandback, who made these incredible spatial, planar, volumetric moves with simple yarn constructions within a gallery. And it's not just about an economy of means. It's also about a sort of an exercise in the precision of thinking. There's also our practice, again, it is not typological, so we sort of cross the boundaries of landscape and architecture and urbanism, furniture and product design at times. But the great thing about that is you get to learn from remarkable people. And I remember actually in pursuit of the St. Louis Grounds project with a terrific friend of mine, a landscape architect, Peter Shout, out of Chicago. We were walking through the sort of mature Dan Kiley landscape that's part of the Jefferson Memorial Grounds in St. Louis, and we were talking about what it meant to do a monoculture of landscape, which was really a signature of Dan Kiley's work. And Peter was the one who said, you know, it's not just about how all these trees look, because they're the same age and they're the same species, and they were selected to be as close to each other, you know, sort of genetically as possible. Stop and listen, because the sound, there's almost a harmonic quality to all of the leaves of the same age, at the same quality, the same character, blowing at the same time. And like the linden trees in the recently finished memorial for FDR in New York City, again, a Dan Kiley designed landscape, there's actually a point when all of those trees go to bloom at the same time, and there's an aromatic quality. And the idea that the things that you need to think about that are actually the drivers of an emotive condition of a space come down to a very little decision, like the replication of a species over and over. And that sort of small idea can become really big. In researching for one of the projects I'll show you later this evening, I was studying and reading a lot about the Dust Bowl. This is for a project we did in Oklahoma, and sort of the how, why, and where Oklahoma came from, and what it's doing in the middle of a tornado alley and crazy, desperate place. And I read about this amazing guy after the Dust Bowl was basically created by the financial accommodation of the industrialization of agriculture across the Great Plains. And they plowed up the Great Plains, and as the price of wheat fell, as the world economy recovered after World War I, as we all know, the plains began to blow away. And there was a guy in FDR's administration that had an idea, and he said, we have to plant trees. I said, okay, we'll plant trees. That's a good idea. 250 million trees in a shelter belt that essentially changed the ecology of the Midwest United States. An idea, plant a tree. And so we try and pay attention to that, not just in sort of conceptual origins, but actually, in fact, in execution. What is the small thing? I'm a avid fisherman, which audience like this I hope appreciates, but I collect these amazing floats that they make in Finland, because they're all varied by, you actually change the kind of float you use for the size fish. And these are going after, whether you're going after a 2-ounce or a 4-ounce herring, and these floats all change. And the kind of specificity of that program that also creates these remarkably beautiful things underlies our thinking about making architecture. A second principle is delight. You know, it's a really tough one, but you know delight because you feel it. It's a powerful emotion, but how do you define that in the context of elements of architecture, and how do you produce that as a sort of a design principle? And again, looking at references, when you just have an incidental, unexpected occurrence, in this case of clouds that line up in a grid formation, or the remarkable aftermath of the wildfires of Yellowstone Park, where you end up with this starkness of the burned out forest, yet the lushness and the optimism of the rebirth of the understory coming up, and it creates this incredibly fabulous aesthetic. And that idea that both the tragedy and the optimism are combined is one that gives you that sensibility. Sometimes it's a pure, almost emotive response, like for a James Turrell, when color itself sort of turns that sensibility within you, or a material condition where you react and you simply must go touch it. And a third, and there's 6 in the book, but I'm going to kind of talk about 3 tonight. Another hard one to define, but a principle that we thought was really important to us, was one of authenticity. in a world where everything is kind of available and referential and convert, what does that actually mean? And so looking at references, this is a quarry where the headstones for the Gettysburg, after the Gettysburg War, the headstones were all carved from this Vermont quarry for Arlington. And it's a man-made space, but it's kind of unintentional, but it has this remarkable quality of light, and it's slightly filled with water, but in the winter when it freezes, it fills completely, and it's the only time you can ever walk into it. Otherwise, you'd have to be in or on the water. And that sort of, there's a moment in there that makes you think about the historical quality, the material quality, the combination of lights, the temporal condition that you actually feel in your gut. And I think you can produce that intentionally. Like this piece of the East Wing by I.M. Pei on the National Mall. Remarkable, also of stone, but in this kind of incredible deliberation that you feel the quality, the thickness, and the sensibility and the monumentality of that piece. I also think that geometry comes with authenticity. And so when you're talking about form making, composition, and organization, I remember seeing this tarmac that was saw cut and with an absolute grid, but then the water collected against those lines and evaporated, and you had this composition and opposition of these two amazing systems working together to create that character. And authenticity is apparent in how we use things and what buildings are. The reason that the Converse shoe is kind of amazing is a grommet is both a vent and it's a place to put a shoestring. And the rubber is there so that when your kids drag his toes, the shoes don't wear out right away. And there's a kind of clarity of materiality and purpose in that. And I also believe that there's authenticity in program. This was from a competition we did for the I-beam Museum in New York City, where we talked about a building that had exhibition, production, and education, and that when you're going to go back and use that building for different things at different time, at different ways, that you actually could build a sort of skill-based way to move through the building, not unlike the way that you learn to ski on a mountain based on your abilities and the conditions and the changing opportunities. And so what I'd like to do is that as a sort of a primer on the backbone thinking is walk through a couple of projects and talk about how those principles influence our thinking about design decisions. The first one is for a project in Washington, D.C. It's called President's Park. It's the area just south of the White House, north of the Washington Monument. And it was traditionally traversed by what was E Street, which has been mostly closed for security reasons. And it's created a real anomaly where this place to the south of the White House, which has been the traditional site of First Amendment protest, and anecdote has it that the president can hear you from the bedroom window when you're yelling on the south side over here. It's critical to sort of our politics, our democracy, and our place. And this is you can see the White House and the grounds in between, and with this roadway which bisected it with the sort of invasion of vehicles in the 50s and 60s through Washington, but now has been shut down and covered with all of these security apparatus, layers and layers that really defy this fundamental relationship between a public space and the White House itself. Diagrammed here, repetitious, overlaying, multiplying, and our proposition was to look back before the automobile had consumed that space to the south of the White House, to the historical origins of the more bucolic park setting as part of the White House grounds, and reimagine a security perimeter that subtly expanded and changed that so that all the space that was available really at the south side of the fence and access to the White House was returned to the public realm, and that this, in fact, could be a place again to restage and reopen to pedestrian use. And so to do that and to meet the security parameters, we said there's two simple things we want to do. The ellipse pitches slightly away from the White House down towards the ground. If you know, Washington was all a swamp, so the White House was on a high point of ground, and everything sloped away from there. And so we said, if we just lift the ellipse, and it's actually just a few 1/1000ths of an inch per foot, almost imperceptible. This is the impact of small things. By the time you get to the other side of the ellipse, you actually have a couple of feet of dimension to work with. And that dimension allows you to occupy the ellipse as you want to, recreational and publicly, but it also means that we can take that secure perimeter and put it at the farthest extent of the ellipse, using that subtle elevation change to create an architectural wall that binds the ellipse, begins to manage some of the stormwater functions, and is illuminated and takes what is the essence of the ellipse, that shape and that form, and by that small, subtle move, actually architecturalize it and turn it into a performative piece of landscape that belongs both to the history of the park, but also to reopening that public relationship between the White House and the space of the park itself. We recently finished a project in Baltimore, East Baltimore, for a new school. And I don't know who's familiar with East Baltimore. It's an incredibly difficult neighborhood. It was, at the turn of the century, it was 100% occupied, owner-occupied, really vibrant working-class community. And like we've seen so many manufacturing centers around the United States, basically became abandoned over the decades, and by the time it's reached our century, had an occupancy of less than 25%. It had this amazing, rich history where the places of work, the building sitting up above is actually a brewery, and people would live here, own their homes, work in the neighborhood, and the places where they worked were actually the landmarks. Those were the centerpieces of these incredibly vibrant neighborhoods. And this fabric was dense and it was rich. And when we got involved, this was a competition, the premise was that they had a master plan to rework the neighborhood, and they'd done some early moves with some affordable housing and some senior housing, but it's like, who's going to move grandpa into this neighborhood? It was not successful, and they got a brilliant new planning director who decided to flip the master plan on its head and said, instead of trying to build this housing and then build a school, why don't we build a school? Why don't we build the best public school in Baltimore City, and then the neighborhood will begin to revive. And he created a partnership with Johns Hopkins University, which is literally 4-minute walk away to their primary medical campus and center from here, and asked them to join him in the neighborhood. And so when we started on the competition to look at it, very progressive pedagogy for the school, it's going to be K through 8. One of the things we began to learn is that there's a very, very deep underlying mistrust between the neighborhood and the community and the large organizations, universities or institutions that said they were coming to help, either because of failed promises, because of very difficult questions of equity between the neighborhoods. And so this mistrust was there. And one of the first things we decided was, you know what, this school can't arrive in the neighborhood like a satellite and say, oh, we're here to save everybody. This school has to come from the neighborhood, and that means both from the community exercise, but also from the typological origin of these row houses and pieces. So if the fabric of the neighborhood was these series of streets and row houses, we felt that the school actually had to do that. It had to hold the street. It had to have the spatial qualities, the scale qualities. At the same time, working with Johns Hopkins, who now had committed their graduate school of education to operate the school and provide all the teaching, looking at the most forward and advanced thinking about the pedagogy of K through 8, where we actually have spatial development for the younger ages to the older ages that actually suggest greater spatial complexity, greater experiential opportunity to participate in your own education by moving around, and tested typologies of classrooms and organizations of classes into these pieces so that 2 classes were grouped together, first and second, third and fourth, et cetera, to create units of 120 children each. And then let those series of building organizations by those grouped ages begin to reestablish the spatial qualities of the site and the organization, letting the green space, the open spaces of the school participate as intimately and specifically as the closed program spaces, linking each one of those sets of 2 grades with what we called a house or a commons that actually became a home base for those 120 students. When you look at the demographics and the conditions within the neighborhood, a lot of these kids actually took all 3 meals at the school. And so we wanted a place of ownership for the kids within the school itself. So we called this the house for each one of the combined grades. There would be a big space for multi-purpose. It's where you had lunch, where you have breakfast, you have teaching, you have breakout. It's big. You can make crazy constructions in here. You can do all kinds of projects. And each one of those would have its own identity and begin to have that marker back within the school, almost the way that the landmarks of the neighborhood had within the neighborhood itself, creating that sense of ownership coming from the neighborhood. With, in the gray on the bottom, all of the community facilities lining the main street, gymnasium, wellness center, social health, auditorium, so that the school actually becomes an extension of the neighborhood in terms of its fabric. And for this neighborhood and for many of these kind of urban environments, the street itself is actually the core of the social program. That's where engagement lies. That's where you crossed over. A lot of these homes were actually quite small, so the place where you see and know your neighbor is in the street itself. And as that became abandoned over time, but the fabric was there and the relationship, our effort was to actually bring that back and to replace the social structure of the street with the social structure of the school and the environment between the classrooms and the working spaces. And even where the typology had these tiny little houses, these were 12 feet wide and 20 feet deep, 2-story houses, worker housing, but this was vibrant and filled at one time. And so we kept this wonderful alley and actually created that as a space where the lower grades move as they go from their classrooms down to the playground. So that the underpinnings of the neighborhood became the underpinnings of the school and carried those same kind of principles into the understanding of the rest of the way that you move through the school. And so when I talk about authenticity, for instance, it's about understanding the origins, the conditions of the neighborhood. What is it like typologically? The houses all kind of step down with the topography as it moves. So the school steps down with the topography as it moves along. And a neighborhood that was made of masonry and very little bits of stone because stone was expensive. And then on the cheaper streets where they used cheaper brick, it actually came back and did this kind of fake stucco work in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but it became a material identity for the neighborhood to recreate that in a custom-produced precast panel that actually took the sensibility of the materiality, the rhythm, the context, the sort of scale of that fabric, and carried it into the new school building within the neighborhood itself, so that these large-scale collective spaces linked and gave identity, but you were constantly able to read through the buildings from one to the other. We did very purposely. One of the things we found out through community meetings and working with teachers was that one of the biggest challenges is there's very little expectation that if you were in school now, it had anything to do with whether you'd be in school later. So that from each one of these houses, like if you're in the 3rd and 4th grade house, you can see the 1st and 2nd grade house, so you know where you came from. But you can also see the 5th and 6th grade house, so you have a spatial continuity. Try to actually endow the architecture with an ability to help that ownership and continuity of the educational experience as it moves through. And those spaces grow and get more complex, as we talked about. So this is up at the 7th and 8th grade, where you've got to manage multiple levels and larger scale spaces as you move through the piece. And the school has come in and resided as a fundamental piece of the neighborhood, not to the neighborhood. I mentioned the shelter belt in Oklahoma. So we started working in Oklahoma a number of years ago. This is a very, it's the difficult oxymoron, but if you can, a relatively benign oil company and a CEO who, there were a couple of big oil companies in Oklahoma City, and one was building a 50-story tower that was going to have all this garish LED lights all over it. It's like, oh my God. And the other one was continuing to build their suburban campus with a sort of mock Georgian-style buildings as if they were some sort of 1800s, campus. And when we met with this CEO, and it was a little kind of limited design competition to get his attention, and I decided to take a little bit of a risk. And I said, you're talking a lot about what you can do for Oklahoma City, and there's a lot you could do besides jobs. And if you thought about building in Oklahoma City and taking on a bunch of the abandoned buildings and the open space that exists in the heart of downtown now, rather than building a signature building, a signature tower, you would actually do a lot more for the city of Oklahoma. Don't do this, do this. And you don't have a single point of entry, you don't wall yourself off, but actually, what if you created a corporate environment that actually was scattered throughout the city, so that it actually was a participant in 25 ways instead of 2 or 3 different ways. And we helped them look for sites and places and programs, and there's the blue line is a sort of major civic access that runs through Oklahoma City. That's where the large-scale civic green spaces occur. And then there's this kind of, on the red, there's a commercial access which was beginning to be a restoration of the abandoned buildings. And this was more of a commercial corridor, beginning to be hospitality, restaurants, hotels. And we said, that's great, let's go right in between those and begin to aggregate and collect the properties, look at the vacant buildings and vacant properties between those, and start to consider it a collection of properties that can still have their own identity and participate together amongst themselves through a variety of devices, simply as how you manage the site and the buildings together as a collection, even if they're very different. And we're going to combine all of these buildings with incredibly high quality public space so that people are out on the street, they're engaged with each other, they're participating in the retail environment, and this is going to be good. And they were reasonably excited about it. We began to talk to people around the city, and they came back and said, you're out of your mind. you know, that's a really great idea with this stuff, but the fact is the weather in Oklahoma sucks and nobody ever goes outside, and, you know, the idea of this public space won't work. We said, well, that's, you know, anecdotally perhaps, but let's do a little science because we believe you actually can go after it. And we worked with Arup's environmental group, and we began to really analyze the microclimate of that environment and began to study the history of weather and environment in Oklahoma. And after the Dust Bowl, when they planted the shelter belt and began agricultural refinement of windbreaks and tree breaks, there's actually an enormous amount of data that has to do with how you affect microclimatic conditions by the management and organization of landscape elements. And we said, all right, let's develop an urban shelter belt and start thinking about how we can create the desirability of these public spaces in the public realm that connects this series of buildings. And the key thing there about public spaces, you know this intuitively as a citizen participant, it's not like you're trying to make one space that works for everybody all the time. You need a series of spaces that give you opportunity in different climatic conditions, different programmatic conditions. Sometimes you want to breeze, sometimes you want to be in the sun, sometimes you desperately need shade. And if you provide that, people are really good at intuitively discovering, finding, and populating spaces that are comfortable. So create a series of those that give you that opportunity and choice, and test it scientifically. So we built a model, we did wind tunnel studies to actually develop where and how the landscape could manipulate the microclimate within that portion of the city to create a whole series of places and situations that were desirable and comfortable and part of the connective tissue. The challenge, of course, is that landscape actually can't handle all of it, and a landscape's actually challenged to deal with the extremes. So we said there's places and times where we have to step in with architecture because that's the only way to get rid of the extreme. And so where we had high wind shear and challenging solar conditions, we actually proposed structures that would participate in the development of the microclimate. And this is a beginning concept. And when we talked about, you know, the qualities of providing shade, you know, when you're in delightful shade, real shade, authentic shade, you know, it's diverse and it changes and it's got structure and it's got character. It's not absolute sun and brightness. And so we decided to use two kinds of materials to create shade, separated at a distance. So even the minute movement of the sun during the day made sure that the shade was dynamic and evolving and always moving a little bit across the space. So we made a structure that would actually break the wind shear off the tallest tower and then create a place for programmatic engagement as part of the public space so that you could use it in small ways with things, light it robustly but simply so that it's inviting and participatory, and actually link all of the buildings. In the end, we did about 5 different buildings for the corporation, all linked together with a sort of identifiable, occupiable public space that served the city. And by the time we were halfway through the project, other empty properties adjacent to this area had significantly gone up in value and been sold and were beginning to be transitioned, and rents increased. And it was incredibly heartwarming that the catalytic effect of the investment was not in this singular piece, but actually something that contributed to a resurgence of downtown Oklahoma in so many ways. So we're also engaged, and this is, again, when I try to happens all the time when I interview with clients because I can't ever quite come up with having done two things, of the same kind. We won a competition for a project at Syracuse University, which is, they had their power plant located down the hill on the railroad because historically it was coal-fired. They'd made some horrible decisions in the 80s and leased it out to a third party that created environmental problems, community problems, economic problems, and they finally got it back, and they're trying to decide, what do we do? We've got to modernize the plant and develop it as cogen. And of course, where was a power plant located when it was built at the turn of the century, and then throughout, right in the middle of public housing sector of Syracuse. So really difficult community relationships. And as they began to master plan for the replacement of the energy plant, it's a much more vibrant, informed, and responsive community surrounding it now, and they got a lot of pushback. And that's when they had a competition architecturally to say, oh, we have to bring in an architect because we've got engineers working on the power plant, but the neighborhood's upset, and so we have to do a little competition to try and make everybody feel like this thing's going to be okay in the middle of their neighborhood. And it's big and it's tough. And we came back with a relatively simple response that said, you can make it look better, and that's fine, but in fact, you can't engage a community through aesthetic changes to the power plant. You have to think about it programmatically, and you've got to embrace the community in which it goes in and let them participate. So let's consolidate and reorganize the pieces as they go together. And they were deathly afraid we were going to make everything too expensive. So we said, no, we're not going to touch the engineering. Leave all of those pieces and parts there just like you want. And we'll organize staff and actually create staff entries on all sides of the project, so it's not just one loaded. Create circulation opportunities for people from the community and from the campus to participate in the life of the plant and understand how it's going to operate, and formalize those, make them apparent and visible in terms of the operations. So we actually created a public circulation route through the plant that connects to the original steam plant that was scheduled to become a maintenance facility and is now going to be programmed as an educational facility and an urban agriculture laboratory, so that it's turned over on the ground floor to community teaching kitchens, community use facilities, and then university laboratories, teaching spaces, and testing greenhouses on the roof, so that instead of being the great beast in the midst of the community, it in fact becomes a part of that neighborhood. And our proposition architecturally was to do that quite simply, take on and make a relatively simple base, go ahead and use the kind of dumb aluminum panel system that you were going to use anyway for the plant. Stick windows and stick louvers in wherever they are. You're never going to be able to organize them because the engineers will control all the locations. Then add windows wherever you've got daylight of workspace, and then actually clad it with a perforated skin that allows the light and air to move through, but it gives us license to operate compositionally and create that circulation path through in a luminous and vibrant way to make it apparent, obvious, and inviting, and take on the roof spaces and manage this thing in a sustainable way in the midst of the community, so that the power plant, in fact, becomes a neighborhood facility that tells you the story about its use and its integration into the surrounding community. Excuse me. So I'd like to talk about a synagogue project. I'm not Jewish, although I was made an honorary Jew by the board at the conclusion of the project. And in fact, during the interview, we were asked, how can you do a synagogue if you're not Jewish? I said, oh, it's good, no problem. You know that I'm going to listen. So I've got no presumptions. And we knew there was architectural ambition there. The original temple had actually been built by Marcel Breuer, but then sort of cobbled up with all of these additions over time, and it was a mess. And so we really had to remaster plan the whole facility. But there's 2 or 3 parts about it that I wanted to bring up in terms of what is, like how do you think about authentic qualities of a spiritual space? And we did lots of studies as we went through the master plan. And as I began to learn a little bit of Hebrew, there was one of the terms I really, really loved called tikkun olam. And there's no direct English interpretation, and to my knowledge, every rabbi interprets it slightly differently, but it's somewhere between mending and repairing the world. And it's a really beautiful idea that through participation in your community, through religious activities, through ceremonies, through singing, that these efforts are, every day you do a little bit to try and repair or mend the world, and that it's this constancy of that effort that is the key to their congregational thinking. And we loved it, and we thought that actually had the potential for our architectural interpretation, where we used cedar, which was the material of the original Temple of Solomon, and poor lonely sheetrock, which is what we can afford in the 21st century, and let those materials wrestle with each other across the sanctuary, but never quite resolve. And they couldn't close. Daylight and the implication of the world was always there in the wrestle between those pieces. And there's 7 of these bands, and only in the 7th band, as you get towards the bima, do you actually begin to get close to resolution. And so light always broke these 2 pieces that were wrestling together, so that there's a clarity of finish, but then there's also this architectural embodiment of that need to continue and wrestle and define. We also had to overcome a fundamental flaw of previous versions of the temple, and the rabbi was really interested in pointing the sanctuary to the east. And that, of course, is a great idea. And he said he also wanted to make sure we had good natural light. We said, that's great. And we had talked about perhaps a spiritual garden in some way being part of the sanctuary. And the trouble was there's a suburban house 20 feet away from the property line. But we really loved the idea of opening up the sanctuary to that east side. And one of the earliest conversations I had with the rabbi was when we were talking about what is spiritual space and how do you define it? How do you understand that? And I love telling this anecdote now on the West Coast because I'm not really a religious person. And when I talked to him about it, I said, but I understand spirituality. And let me give you the example is, the first time that I ever visited a redwood forest, the sound underneath the foot of the needles, the quality of the light, the dimensions, and your immediate understanding of, your smallness in the world, but you're still a piece, you're a part, that was powerful. And one of the reasons it is because it changes all the time. It's never going to be the same any 2 times you ever go there. And he got very excited about that. And that's when we said, well, we should have this east wall that opens out to the garden, and that's the way we'll have, nature involved directly in the liturgy. I said, well, that's great, but facing east, you've got morning ceremonies, and that's a fundamental problem. We're going to need a louvering system that will keep the sunlight from being too bright, and you can't be backlit because then you'll be a silhouette. Nobody will see your facial expressions. And so we began to talk about what that wall should be like. And I said, you know, maybe it's not really looking at a garden. Maybe it's like the idea, like the way that you see reflections on water. It's not really the real thing. I mean, it's known in the art world. It's amazing. My wife, who is my partner, we were on a trip, happened to be at Amsterdam while we were working on this project, and we saw this painting at the Van Gogh Museum. I said, oh, that's it. That's, you know, that is what we want the East Wall to become. And so what if it were this collection of louvers and reflections that actually change with the seasons and the time of day? And every time in there, you knew the seasonality and the quality of what was going on. So we began to build mock-ups and testing different mirrors and angles and bent pieces of glass. And we found somebody who was distressed glassmaker in Detroit who's willing to do a lot of work with us to try and figure this out, and developed a series of prototypes of these bent glass louvers that were mirrored on the underside. And so what you're looking at on the left-hand side is 4 or 5 sheets of colored paper that are on the ground immediately behind that piece, reflected up into the wall. So it also gave us the sun louvers, but it also gave us the idea of the garden, but not literally the idea of the garden. And so we built that louvered wall to protect from the sunshades, and then planted the garden right behind the wall on the outside. And the good thing is, like, the last people you ever want to trust with your architecture is the flower committee at the synagogue, because you know they're going to put garish, horrible stuff in there. And this is where you're like, great, put the most garish things you can possibly do. Plant it right outside, whatever you like. It'll be terrific. And so the wall changes all the time, and the color comes up in, and it changes with the seasons. And when the wind blows, it moves. And it's become this sort of powerful, careful, spiritual wall that really brings that tiny little piece of garden space into the sanctuary throughout. Don had mentioned a little bit about public realm, and we've been working a lot in public realm. And I love it. It's a place where really the disciplines cross, and you kind of get rid of the idea of disciplines. What is urban design? What's architecture? What's landscape? Because you really want to eliminate those divides in the outcome. So why would you allow them to exist in the structure of your thinking? So not unlike your own Willamette Falls here, we've been working in Minneapolis on the St. Anthony's Falls, also a river city, basically built on industry, with an incredible hydraulic system that was built up over time on the one site of a natural waterfall on the Mississippi. That location was over very hard limestone over a very soft sandstone. And so there's actually, over millennia, the rock has crumbled and collapsed as it undercuts and then falls. And that's the sort of origin of the Twin Cities. St. Paul is where that rubble water stops, and so that's the highest navigable point on the Mississippi. And then Minneapolis is where the waterfalls were, so that was where the hydraulics were built to manage the early milling and operations. And they literally were right in and on top of the water, with originally lumber and then later with grain milling, and created this incredible sort of sets of milling apparatus, tunnels, canals, everything that went in. And of course, as fossil fuels took over all of that industry, ended up basically being demolished, paved over with parking lots, and became a sort of back of house wasted waterfront for this incredibly vibrant city. So our project was to weave this back into the fabric of the city. So one, creating connections so that linkages and opportunities to use the space were not singular and isolated, but actually multiple and linked. And where there were ruins remaining on the site of the waterfront through there, we began to look at how those could be partially reused. Now, some people were really crazy about the Yun ruins, others less so. I mean, in the end, they're kind of rubble foundations that are 100 years old. So we weren't callous, but we were also trying to be realistic about what and how much you would actually restore and why. But the ruins themselves and the hydraulic works origins of the factory in the city were incredibly important and vibrant. So we wanted to completely resculpt the section where everything had been filled on the riverbank to come back and create habitable, occupiable zones that allowed you to begin to explore the ruins in a way that gave them a volumetric presence, but not some new or different kind of use in the park. And restructure the circulation paths so you could get down to the water and around the water, and actually create places where the hydraulic systems are referenced. Most of them were very deep, so there's water features and other elements that are a part of the park that talk about how that system actually fed. That was where you see the triangle of water was kind of the main head gate that actually took water 2 or 3 blocks back into the city and then down for another 3 or 4 blocks, feeding all of the mills. And creating all these sections and level changes also gave us incredible accessibility issues in terms of public space and public park. And so we chose to place a single building, new building in the park at that Gordian knot of circulation where all of those levels linked together, so that was the place you had a moment of respite, a place to get a drink or a bite, but it also had elevators and stairs that made the entire series of parkscape accessible and operable, and takes this industrial functioning waterfront and returns it back with a sort of subtle historic underlay to the city of Minneapolis. In St. Petersburg, Florida, competition we won about 8 months ago, they originally built a railroad pier out into Tampa Bay. It's about a 1/4 mile out into the bay. That was so they didn't have to dredge and they could have the heavier draft cargo and fishing boats offload, and then they brought it in on sort of little electric and steam carts into the water. And everybody started going out on the fishing tracks, on the tracks to go fishing, and sort of became a public space. So they expanded it into a pier that actually had public use components on it, as well as getting out to the deeper draft vessels. And by the time of the 1920s, they'd actually constructed almost like a causeway out to a platform with a great big casino dance hall ballroom out in the middle of it. And it had become a iconic point of nightlife and energy and public function for St. Petersburg. This, which was called the $1 Million Pier, burned down and was replaced by a very challenging structure, placed out there that had a bunch of cheese ball retail and a restaurant on the top floor that, that's where you went for graduation day, or you took grandma on Mother's Day or something, but it wasn't a part of the life of the city. And the city continually had to subsidize the cost of structure over water and everything that goes on. So they finally condemned this and decided that they had to demolish the pier, and had a competition to replace it. And our proposition was, you're spending public money, you're replacing this entire pier. The idea of a singular destination retail is absurd, and you really need to think about it in a contemporary environment of what is public space. You had these city fathers that had the foresight to actually preserve a lot of the waterfront land and turn it over to public occupancy. So you've got a kind of wonderful band of shoreline park, and you should think of the pier in the same way. And so instead of saying that there's an experience out at the end of the pier, make the entire pier the experience. Instead of thinking that you need some iconic thing sitting out on the end, actually your experience, enjoyment, and the phenomena of being on the pier itself should be an iconic experience. And this idea of the singular transit, where it's the same going out and coming back, and I'm just going to go get a crappy T-shirt and have an expensive lunch or something, you know, it's a bad idea. And why don't you make this thing as vibrant and rich as possible? Give yourself multiple ways and multiple routes on and off of the pier, lots of things to do. Make sure that you've got a route. We had a route we called the grandkids route, you know. That's a place where you've got someplace to sit down every 150 feet in the shade, or a place to play and get a thing. And then there's somebody who really wants to get to the restaurant at the end. And all of those things should be a part of that process. And so we redesigned the pier to have less overwater coverage than the previous one, but about 10 times the programmatic set of activities. So there's robust landscape when you're on ground as you're getting ready to leave and step out. There's a welcome plaza with a splash pad where grandma's in the shade and the kids are out in the sun running and playing. And on the back side of that tilted lawn, you know, there's porch swings and places to hang out, because we felt it was really critical that even though you've got restaurants and facilities there that are part of the economic drivers for the revitalization of the pier, this is about a public space and a public use. And so we told the city, you know, whether you have 50 cents or $50, you ought to be able to spend a day on the pier. And so the different pieces separate. We thought it was important to be a piece of landscape, and we're working with the landscape architect Ken Smith on this, who has constructed this idea of this coastal thicket, which is wholly fabricated, but it's not about you're building this crazy thing a quarter mile out over the bay, all right? It's not about some environmental thing. This is a big construct in the middle of the bay. And so the landscape is not about pretending to be a mangrove swamp. The landscape is a poetic experience that allows you to move in shade and on a boardwalk, so that when it's 2 or 3 people moving out there, you have the opportunity of that experience. But when we've got a concert at the end and we have to move 3 or 4 or 5,000 people out there, you've got a concourse and a walkway that can handle those kinds of crowds. And we felt it was critical that you had access to the water, that you not just be over the water, but that you actually have opportunities to get in the water. So there's kayak spaces and kayak clubs, and out on the far end, there's actually a pool that's just 8 inches deep, but it's the bay water that flows in from underneath, so that you can, if you're a tourist, you can just take off your shoes and kind of plop your feet in there and buy a very expensive margarita. And so the restaurant still is housed at the end. It overlooks a lawn where we can have public concerts, and trying to combine this combination of public amenity and revenue driver resource in a public place that has the experience for everybody there, yet still has the iconic presence that they desire in terms of a city relationship to their pier. And I'll finish with one more public realm, and this is, I think it's the only Don Stastny competition we've won, but someday there'll be another. So on the National Mall, Constitution Gardens is, if you see the little red marks, the V mark is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and the sort of partial ovals are World War II. Constitution Gardens is between those two spaces, right there. And it was designed back in the 1970s, when the mall was still occupied with temporary war buildings that had been left clear since World War II, and Nixon commissioned the Constitution Gardens to honor the bicentennial. And so they tore down all those buildings, and they did it very quickly, and in classic government contract fashion, left a lot of the debris there, and built the park really quickly. A very elegant design by SOM and Dan Kiley, one of the really only clearly modernist designs that are on the mall today. So, you know, looking at the biomorphic forms of burley marks and things, but in terms of the way that the water feature was developed and the relationship. But the park has fallen into great disrepair, both because of maintenance issues with National Park Service, but also because it was built relatively quickly and the fill was not good. We've got 40-year-old trees that are, you know, 4.5 inches around. And so working with the landscape architect, Pete Walker, in his office, we came in and said, you know, the underlying idea for Constitution Gardens was actually quite right. So the idea of the geometry of the lake and the water is great, but we need to augment it. The subtle sculpting of the land was good, but it wasn't really enough. We actually need to be more abrupt with it so we can use it for acoustic isolation from traffic, for instance, for better management of stormwater. And although there was planting and landscape, it was not very robust. We need a robust and vibrant woods to create the park. There had been a proposition for a building and a pavilion to help provide services because there's really not much on the mall at all. We thought now we need to make sure that that building happens there. And the circulation needed to be revised to accommodate the new memorials that had been built since the origin. So the proposition from Pete Walker and partners was that we actually cover all of the bad soils underneath, produce new fill, develop layers of filtering water management that also provide acoustic isolation from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Because if you've got a park-like environment and you have a memorial that's highly emotive, you actually need separation of things like sound from somebody having laughter party running around is a different thing. We needed to deal with the trees and the landscape. Many needed to be replaced, removed, relocated to deal with this. And to create this robust, vibrant, growing lake edge that actually is part of a way to filter the stormwater on the site and link all of those together in a way that actually manages. The water had also always been run from a potable source, and we wanted to make it both natural and replenishable from the environment on site. And the building needed to be there. So we thought it was important that the building be quiet and it be fundamentally a part of Constitution Gardens, so it stays within the canopy height of the garden itself. That what had happened since the original building had been sited, which we liked, the idea at the head of the lake, the World War II memorial had been built, and it was on a direct axial relationship with the sidewalk right through the middle where the original building had been proposed. So we said, let's push the building out towards the lake to make sure that that sight line is clear down to World War II. And not just prop it there, but actually open it up so it favors the lakeside and lift it up a little bit as it cantilevers out over the lake so that as you approach it, actually you have to gain the vantage of the view by moving into and through the pavilion, so that the pavilion serves as a threshold moment, both to take a moment and look out at the memorials and sites on the mall, but also to move through and down to the lake level. So, like so many buildings in DC, way more than half of it is below ground, so we could provide services and accommodations for national parks, for restrooms, for concessions, all the things that the mall is in desperate need of to actually serve its function, handling almost 30 million people a year. And create a place that's the identifiable destination point for those services, functions and operations within there. And we looked hard at what the geometry of this structure wanted and needed to be. And so we looked back to the underlying geometry of the L'Enfant plan for Washington, D.C., which had those two angles, and let that become the splay point for how the structure operates. What it does is it creates a series of individual little triangles in the truss that actually create, when you see them in perspective like that, a slight curvilinear quality. So it's built of diamond-shaped sections that are linked together, full-size mock-up scale, and then it sets up, and you can see just the tiny little lyrical curvilinear shape that comes from that geometry as you look out over the lake. Our own little nod to understanding that sort of the biomorphic forms of the original lake and the original pieces. So when I talk about a little move, or what is authenticity, and when do you find delight, and how do you begin to construct all of those principles together into a single structure in a single location that gives it the kind of inherent poetic quality that makes you feel like it belongs. Thank you. Okay, you bet.
Don't go. Come on, Jody. Okay. I don't think you'll ever be a starchitect, but you are truly a master architect. Thank you for coming. Thank you. We have a tradition here at the Industry Forum, in that there is a tradition among the tribes in the area that when someone comes into our family, who comes into our group, that we honor them with a blanketing ceremony. So with this, what we would like to do is formally blanket you with a blanket by Edith Pitt, who is one of our Warren Springs artists, and the title is River People. It is the people of the Columbia. And Rob, what we want you to do is be a part of our family and come back.
Thank you very much. Now I'll look at home in the park.
And if we could just get a picture. Thank you so much for coming and blessing us with your beautiful work and your wonderful words and your spirit. Thank you so much, Rob. Thank you. Thank you all. Good night. Thank you all for coming and enjoying this this wonderful evening and presentation with us. It was very, very wonderful work. And thank you for being here. And we'll look forward to seeing you next year at the Industry Forum. So take good care. Good night. Drive safe.